Muzi, what's your syntax?
Okay.
What's his syntax? Do you assume that he can't speak English or something? Okay. Sorry. Okay.
I need like a minute.
Yeah, no, take your time. Okay.
Okay, ready for the code.
Okay. Lowercase h, lowercase w, capital B, capital K, lowercase c, capital R. Get ready for the one out con.
Alright, I am ready when the two of you are.
I'm good.
Advantage one is centrality, competition, migration, limits, labor mobility between ASEAN states, limits of regional labor markets, Code 16. ASEAN economic communities in terms of ASEAN region with free movement of goods, service, skilled labor, capital, free movement of skilled labor, like the high likelihood of regional free markets, and the production of policy related political strategies, keys, labor mobility, is essential, like for making it higher from other ASEAN member states, so labor policy, labor priorities, Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, like the benefit from therefore their ASEAN states, other countries require informal labor, such as common guidance for the growth of regional business sectors, will workforce for economic to become entire foreign workers, and no incentive higher from ASEAN means following same visa work permit procedures, and within the sector for ASEAN development, plus Alaska, and economic integration, Commons 2018. It was like moving to taking place in Congo, while volume has been going to Japan, not change with the senior China to achieve competitive and dynamic economy across industry, career productivity, to the innovation of the workforce, the center growing demand for attractive change, circulate talent, innovation need, goes beyond highly skilled, they may have a low skilled market, they increase to be growing in sources, scarce, and maybe more keep growing, senior population successful, very short to others, to PhDs, to create like conditions, the crimes, right for putting cross border movement, the strength of that do this like that station economies, and integrate economic communities that sector ASEAN centrality leadership by 14. ASEAN local regional stability, increasing prosperity, and pivotal, the whole Eastern region, some extent of new road to regional leadership, and ASEAN customer moving towards ASEAN, single market, the security, trend, economic development, high priority income gaps, will be now really more deeply integrated economic integration, correct, prosperity, ASEAN holds key to broader regional political cooperation, and regional privileges start driven by ASEAN are key to leadership integration, are keys centrality, January 16. The drive to crucial ASEAN development, international unity, the ideals, and discuss play leading driver role, vis-a-vis regional dynamics, pushing beyond ASEAN's ability to active leader driver and conquer with as extra components, or component ASEAN, it's just not trying to draw, relatively increasing, here, economic process, ASEAN, service, foundation, ASEAN, and credibility, joint, the trying to return internal progress, next on broadening regional community building, alignment, regional instruments, build, help ASEAN solidify centrality, constant reminder to behave and active here in the efforts to intrusive China's on paper practice, and change secure environment, centrality on edge, reaffirm commitments and coherence to integration, check back, values, will be. Not to ASEAN change secure environment, by China, Israel, can also remain part of both US and China, to accept each other for like greater community, regional outlooks, and new customer member, things to manage the purpose, ASEAN, to Israel, and also ASEAN driven by creative efforts, connectivity, balance, architecture, and emphasis with trade, continued relevance, and ASEAN's trying to keep it inclusive, transparent, rules-based order that solves Asian conflicts, 1922. Global ASEAN centrality was codified as trying to drive force, and its cooperation, and its crucial open transparent, and with rules-based regional architecture, ASEAN has been more effective than any other form for managing potential conflicts, and building regional security, able to China and sign the conduct of parties, and trying to import managing potential conflict in US and planetary products, has been called by ASEAN intervention, because most meaningful official multilateral security forums, ASEAN is the only way to come together as a meeting power in the world, and prefer middle power diplomacy built on ASEAN's empirical success, welcome to 28. I want to be determining peaceful prosperous pathways by player 3 dead, the analyst believe is business from conflict, is now this 5th decade, peace for nation, conflict, domestic, ethnic, and religious diversity between ASEAN, myself, forged cooperative regional built on cooperative accommodation, ASEAN able to drive because the great powers can only agree, we can't do so as long as the major powers have neutral independent model, primary causes, some approach, world leadership, and zero sum approach, and Asia war aspects outweigh the 17. Asia most ties the world, 7 large cultures are all in Asia, out of 7 stations, nuclear power, foundation, like behind increasing military, territorial, like regional security, structure, good military arsenals, Asia possibly more than use of military force, after all, habitat, retaliation, use of military power, cause scale military conflict, so the class neutralized to war. Got them most of that stuff. Advantage 2 is a regular migration. Regular migration supports transnational organized crime, border controls over cost, alternative 1. Organized migration pressure cause crime inflation to emigrate, limitations legal migration opportunities, to let people illegally to migrate, found in terms offered by traffic organizations, thousands of age specific by government resident organizations, allow migrant traffic connection to drive traffic, criminal organizations, or knowledge taking new market opportunities, and criminalizing Asian organized crime businesses, communities simultaneously, criminal narcotics organizations, land expertise, and black labor market, illegal disease, explain just everything different, this is finally pulls the border control different countries, migrancy, trafficking is the only available avenues to control, like this illegal service trafficking, organizations who travel documents, move from one country to another, search international traffic, and includes wide part of documents, and criminal activities related to migrant, depends on possession, documentation, murder, characteristic of Asia-Pacific link with corruption, government law enforcement, border control, customs, trafficking, awareness of migration regulations, migration for the institutions under humane conditions, and to burst culture, border controls, forced migrants in the hand of third parties, and against conscious major revenue flow, and the virus of 13. Power force directed migration, literacy, and attempts to control migration, kingdom migration, regenerated demand for status migration policy, linked to wanting border surveillance, migration, gap service, and third parties, Russian migration, Asia, facilitated by third parties, from migration schemes, and based on more expensive migrants, into Canadian grow markets, acceptable use, expectation, trafficking, board of the public relations, these potential violence, migrants, human rights, frontline immigration, official participating in talk, formats, and activity, migrants held, and then it's for considerable periods of time, and migrants plugging plus organized time carries of FHF 22. Migrants plugging into the pricing terminal, numbers live on demand for selling service, and pricing product be access to USD 10 million migrants, smugglers laundering pricing then using third parties and laundering their behalf. Migrants pay smugglers and cash business includes perfect virtual assets, are beginning fees and criminal activity, migrants smuggling criminal groups, increasing outsourcing money flows across border between terrorist financing, migrants smuggling trade funds, terrorist groups smuggling migrants, and Southeast Asia organized crime puts money into the hands of terrorist groups, organized crime states, drug trade, so drug trade, 19, counter next South Asia countries of MGA, state criminal spreads to Asia to employ terrorist behavior, linked to violence, organization of crime and lawbreakers, includes the Golden Triangle, West Large open producing region, opium trade, coinciding the national production of synthetic narcotics, Southeast Asia, ASEAN terrorist organization, also between violence and property-driven organized crime, symbiotic interaction between criminality and terrorism, creates opportunities for illicit actors, channel communities, affiliation between terrorists and criminal groups, and separation of entry and Southeast Asia terrorism, primary influence, lawless insecurity, least vicious cycle that allows entry into criminal terrorist activity, and where public funnel is to northeast India, same 20. Current dominating northeast Indian region, north traffic, intermediate reference, marijuana, popular grown common, underground traffic, and drug violence, insurgent groups, sex finance, themselves, science, organized for helping militancy, drug trade, along with borders of the Golden Triangle, international drug trade, and connection to insurgent drug trafficking, impact on east, northeast, southeast, Indian district, group, depend on the ages, black markets, and supply weaponry, groups not resort to smuggling, drug dealing, and not sustain their qualities, who continue to major source of revenue, so control drug trafficking, international narco network, supported by armed militants, particularly able to post narco trafficking, or narco production, topographical, geographical circumstances, hash drug, taxing, purchasing narco traffickers, its weapons for the insurgency, trying to use security forces, athletes, separately, drug weapons, and swift flight funds, growth schemes, and accuracy of like trafficking regulated by transporter routes, and militia negotiated control, and all pilot transports from northern Indian centers, by critically vulnerable nuclear resistance, actually going to pop on us and war off in all 20. Enthusiastic terrorists who want to decry nuclear weapons, open to terrorism, communication, transcendent, unidentifiable, non-established government, terrorists require or where nuclear is easy to target, Indian comments in the China, Al-Qaeda, Qaeda, Incision, Emirates, and Burning Northern India, attacks from Indian nuclear facility, planet, executed terrorists, uses for nuclear radiation, Pakistan, responsible death, attacks in Poland, Pakistan, launching terrorism, India, operational, conventional force, launching land warfare, Dr. in 2018, and launching nuclear attack, nuclear doctrine, post-mass retaliation response to CBWs, these are the current at CBWs, that's a plan, which requires more into countries than the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and plans also migration flows, but economic integration, Kyoto 16. As Southeast Asian countries want to make their common market work, likely foreign independent regional economies, so Southern border people and false and Schengen Muslim people move for the cross-border pass and check to result, relocates to cross-border trade, relocate to local companies and region, utilize human resources, multiple nationalized, integrated dynamic ways of a company wants to relocate to know their frequently destination countries, rules, leads, immigration, labor, often send the way, connecting people as the key success for the ASEAN, for the ASEAN framework, standards, and dominant act, utilitarianism, make 16 outweighs all its infinite future values, so killers, possibly generate air acts, and make cognitive bias, and the team. Giving peacefully because not noticed that with this hundreds of infinite future best also make happy to time fractional whole supply surgery, catastrophe would be destroyed the people one person have large legs and catch you give future generations nothing else so that the attention those one global fucking generations of the centuries puts on precedent economic devices also people underestimate race of the neglect.
Alright. Good for 6?
Yep.
Okay. The cards about sort of middle power and ASEAN centrality are from like 2022 and 23 and say that ASEAN is currently leading great power disputes and is like shaping a third wave for diplomacy. What piece of evidence do you have right now that ASEAN is ineffective?
Yeah, so the Bosch P12-8 evidence is from 2022 and talks about why ASEAN right now is facing challenges to security environment. That means that its like ability to assert itself and bring these powers to the table is teetering on the brink.
Well, that says that there's like a changing environment. It doesn't say that ASEAN is ineffective. The next like previous two and the next two cards both say that ASEAN is currently resolving those disputes through multilateralism.
Clarify the norms, values, and principles that drive ASEAN's external engagement and ensures continued relevance in a new era of power politics.
Yeah,
the problem is that these changing security environments would influence the reasons why it's like effective.
Okay,
right?
like the first advantage broadly, some of your evidence seems to be talking about like hampers on integration, about like things like tariffs, protectionism, etc. Do you have a piece of evidence that says that even like post-plan, they would then spill over to integrate more broadly and overcome those other barriers?
A few things. So one, our evidence makes claims about why migration is comparatively more important than other factors. Second of all, is that the Drysdale evidence talks about why centrality and leadership would be different post-plan, i.e. having more unified economic policies.
I guess about that, do you have any evidence that says that migration alone is sufficient for multilateralism?
We don't read a multilateralism, in fact.
Or like, well, middle power, like resolving, your cards are like multilateral dispute resolution through ASEAN. Do you have a piece of evidence that migration alone is sufficient to solve that?
Yeah, all of our evidence is talking about why this creates a new unified ASEAN, why this leads to better centrality and more coherent policy. Like every piece of conflict association, like the 2016 evidence, labor mobility in ASEAN, like it's all talking
goods,
about
services,
why
investment and free flow of capital.
The free movement of skilled labor lags behind. Like this is talking about labor mobility and why that kind of labor mobility matters.
All right. The second advantage: if terrorist forces are so motivated that they would get a nuclear weapon, why wouldn't they switch to other forms of profit other than human smuggling post-plan?
A few things. So first of all, that Evans talks about why they're able to make comparatively more money. For example, Al-Qaeda gets like almost 90% of its profits, a same number, from trying to forge fake passports and documentation smuggling people across borders. Second of all, is having like infrastructure. They need to have these networks of human smuggling in order to have effective operations.
About like opium and drug smuggling in particular.
Yes. So that's because the FATF evidence, while it's talking about global terrorism, is explaining how there are these links from like human smuggling, where that money gets reinvested into drug trafficking. If you sever that flow of money, then you don't get to the drug trafficking later on, because you need that kind of like capital to start up the business.
Seeing evidence about the like Northeast Indian insurgents says that they grow drugs domestically and get profit within India. Even if you cut off their profits from ASEAN, why could they not just expand those operations?
Evidence to think about why it's drug trafficking from Myanmar to India. There's a line that says Northeast India's insurgent groups do not depend on Southeast Asia's black markets to supply the Northeast Indian insurgent groups depend on Southeast Asia's black markets to supply weaponry.
Because if they don't rely on them alone.
No, sorry, I misspoke. No, it's not. They do rely on them. They depend on Southeast Asia's black market to supply weaponry. If they did not resort to smuggling, they would not sustain their cadres.
Okay, it's 4 then case. Case is advantage 1, advantage 2.
I think that this is the wrong one in C.
Oh, I swear I said round 5, but okay, that it should be enough.
Okay, we good.
Okay, anyone not good?
Okay.
All right. First on the topicality, interpretation, open borders is unrestricted and unconditional, absent any government checks. The plan is only between member states, which is not open. Harker. 2. What would open borders look like? People are free to cross without incurring any official powers, visa requirements, or quotas. Anyone is free to cross. Questions asked who. It doesn't matter. Anyone and everyone is free to cross the Latin or any legally is not open borders. So instead, immigration control, which bureaucrats decide who enter. Vote night for limits are granted. The only limiting word in the resolution is open borders, absent full openness and a limited amount of bilateral, regional, and multilateral options. Reverted the negative generics. Every DA assumes full openness, which is distinct in the literature. Their term undermines core negative strategy about line borders, so that remain mostly closed. Key is voting issue for fairness and education. Next, office and taxation, common law, and justice towards the Association of Southeast Asian Nations levy a progressive tax and unrestricted migration countries within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as a function of immigrants' fiscal net present value with revenue generated page essentially fund pandemic preparedness. It solves the case in Ross. 12% of percent of determined education rate is just indicated we're going to deposit an NPP or MPP higher exchange location increases 5-fold difference. Effective needed foreigners would pay a very high rate would be rational for immigrants to pay to work, but the payoff is massive and would solve illegal movements. But 20 technical immigration credits would not create incentive immigrant deposit would be less than the opportunity eliminating illegal all foreigners for example URITI instead 45 million immigrants actually $80 billion revenue per year plus accounts and existing taxes revenues increase dramatically. Targeted funding solves emerging pandemics, extinction Moody, 2-1 disease access series and national pandemic cause of disease which are always double connection one is one of the disease access infecting study the human population study is greater than ever as serious with global security one in Japan global scholarly for 1.6 similar interstellar species exists over the celebrity of intervention testing dramatically so relevant for the development and the road is the production disease was an existential threat with management plans to make it limited pandemics permanent the capital sellers open borders make immigration shares all shorter open borders and some migrants is suited for migrating based on cost. Next off is the Myanmar pit capital tax justice powers open borders migration between Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, and the Philippines. Myanmar is bad for ASEAN. Unique for section ASEAN to lessons including fighting Robert. We were also in relation to bad that's really good fun. Nepal, ASEAN, banning Myanmar, ASEAN, Myanmar, generals for meetings and issuing vague threats. ASEAN, punishment of Myanmar. Burma's military coup is losing steam. Maintain unity and aid in flux. Marcel, what you? NDAA passed authorized support for society in Myanmar and GAPD authorized assistance for resistance. Authorized funding Biden administration moving faster resistance. Spread money for education, health care message, and for Russia, China, Mucha, losing support China, Russia, China, support, happy to work with you. And technology, no evidence, future stabilizer gains, popular support, United Front push, military out of power, specifically Thailand supported hundreds of thousands of migrants back to the economies. 13. Burmese refugees to hire me to order back out threatening to destroy the cancer, delivery, food, water, medicine, 250,000 government refugees as unwanted, warranty gets all. Without reselling Thailand eventually will come begin to happen 2011 policy to return Burmese refugees to Myanmar sent back as balance continues very common. Constricted domestic immigration policy has also caused exodus of Burmese citizens to Myanmar to now 21 Myanmar citizens travel abroad for restrictions required OWICPJ. Passport will turn away more visas to laws of OSC. Introduces never enforced many people never issued cards or have heard who just had rules to complicate Myanmar workers. That causes brain drain that's only been prevented by strict laws and illegal migration fails because brokers scam Frontier 920. inflation, exodus, disaster policy, balloon, digitalization, construction policy, imports, and policy, women's capital disingenuous workers, vanishing for the cash, women climate broker locked in, everyone less than paid ransom, should impose good economic risk and conscious slaves, brain trade that wrecks the economies and causes field states to poor. 17. Small countries that capable of rich and child more pressing and medium pressures, so we're currently capital or immigration further. Deeply weak institutions, which have been safe, yielding capital, control, institutional trade, global action, as a skill, immigration worse than that spills over regionally, extinction, Kevin. 10. The Myanmar military decided to become a nuclear power, would be found over Roman nuclear fission, have no foreign enemy, ethnic, armed movement, starting for our people, invaded military regime, nuclear power, make Southeast Asia, more regime, insecure, and stable, away from nuclear arms, is a little world, India, major warfare, requiring to start weapons, nuclear bombs, Dutch humanity, next office, Indonesia, pick, counter tax, just requires open borders for human migration between Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, and the Philippines, Indonesian deforestation, is low now, kept 22, Indonesian deforestation rate, historical low, labor market programs, worker protection, seeks to advantage of reducing the balance of force and COVID periods of income, uncertainty, these programs, and combination with the direction, forest protection policy about reducing deforestation, record lows, both limit health ecosystems and other loss of biodiversity, legality for about illegal logging and control. A consensus of studies prove immigration in Indonesia uniquely results in deforestation. German to see migration level for the loss of forest cover Indonesian migration, increase in population, countries restrict sellers, deforestation, migration, open forests land as they face countries and climate land with the local people, ranks and border structure affected the forest and culture. Residency for the short-term planning horizon, the 1960 Indonesia settled more than 3.6 will considered to be villages impact of Indonesia's world spontaneous migration, first migrants without the sponsorship of the government, spontaneous migrants increase and for lack of more damaging effects, they can independently introduce new forces and any supervision by clothing sample image from sense of the world, we can confirm a positive relationship between migration and deforestation. Indonesia is a unique global biodiversity hotspot. Patriarchal. 16. Southeast Asia overlaps with 4 hostage diversity parts, environments, benefits, all the species already increasing ecosystem, contributions, ecosystem, around a variety of human methods, forests in Southeast Asia being short faster than other regions. Essentially, it has a valuable velocity. Deep understanding the implication of how Indonesia short of has the highest rate of the highest species restrictions will come to a variety of unique ecological processes. Many species are not essential for systems like the full complex of yet to be measured. Extinction, tipping points, overall resilience balance. 17. The European will cause deforestation, European diseases, and domino effect will cause extinction of many more species and through poverty, pollution, human disease, or the only one this is just every possible is still possible. The centrality advantage. ASEAN economic integration is impossible. Conjunction of vague agreements, implementation of failure, structural barriers, and domestic circumvention make it impossible. Regime. AC's implementation takes place all launch negotiations with details later 4 years after fundamental issues are still under discussion. The ASEAN League to coordinate integration, such important access and time to agree on removal of barriers of the 6,000. Not a single barrier has been removed. The China will continue to grow structural problems. Question whether integration can ever be actually ASEAN will not interfere. Does not suitable for cross-border trust. Single market misleading the Chelsea situation. The AC falls short of national regulation. The ABU means that members who are commitments they find inconvenient sense of fundamental political collaboration. The ASEAN is vulnerable to politicization. Should be to be implied by political order rather than independent entities. Means that the ASEAN will be aboard the mechanism has never been revoked. Implementation structural weaknesses, including branding companies, and investors are unlikely to take AC into consideration. Skilled workers already move, and unskilled workers aren't offered. Actually, I'm gonna skip that part. There's no uniqueness for the impact of Mabubani evidence and the Hui evidence are describing the status quo and say ASEAN is currently an effective middle power and leading a third wave multilateralism, and they're both from post 22 and 23. They have no evidence that is not strong now, but irreconcilable foreign policy differences impede unity and economic integration weakens credibility. When Steve Ashby, Gordon appears to regional outlook is needed to say such drifting parts and preference and such order lost nobody while Israel that order Philippines advance and Singapore are ambivalent situation receiving of engagement with a purpose technology, engagement with technology, ASEAN is German, but more than just economic considerations, trade and presence, leadership, ensure balance regional architecture, middle power, ASEAN is structurally incapable of solving conflict mod. 2. ASEAN silence will great power competition valley, ensure balance system security order, economic headwind, struggling to effective resources, security, China's national started for including a question of conflict relations, and Ukraine all challenges of alliance ability to resolve demonstrate agency rather than all element use alliances squad and IEQAs, bypass the consensus to wide marketing commercial over the failed ASEAN's ability to shape events and limit the right complete indifference to international pressure comfortably seem to hit the best are behind now will never be completely united. Insufficient command attention. That card is marked insufficient command attention. The second advantage, there's obviously a distinction between the amount of migration and the status quo. They need increased migration for their labor integration control. So even if there's some irregular migration, does not take out RDAs, but they cannot solve it first shift. Even if there's no human smuggling, criminal groups still exist and need revenue. And they've made the argument that they're highly motivated. They do things like laundering, fraud, tobacco, and smuggling, etc. 22 migrant smuggling groups including hostage professional laundering networks involved in racial primarily trafficking, tax smuggling, alcohol, alcohol money. But it's true the entire advantage lacks reverse hostile evidence. They have no evidence that terrorists rely on smugglers just that they are a singular source of revenue. If they're right, that terrorists are highly motivated, they pivot to other illicit networks. Terror completely fails. When you see Ahmed, 20 terrorists have psychological, easily psychological pressure, intense situations, cybersecurity terrorists may not achieve terrorists, have not limit terrorists will now I've never be able to cause a structure. They have used all possible means, Al Qaeda have not created significant achievement. Yeah, that's fine. I'll send a more copy.
Great. Good for us?
Yeah.
Great. Status of the alts?
Calm down.
Okay, great. This Indonesia pick, the study is talking about internal Indonesian migration. Why does migration within ASEAN states affect that?
Well, the argument is about increased housing permits and deforestation as a result of it. Even if the study is broadly about immigration, the same warrant for why that would be destructive to forests it still applies to people outside because they need land.
The plan doesn't give the type of packages for subsistence and land, which is what that study is talking about. So why does it matter that more people from, say, the Philippines are going to Indonesia? They are not getting government-sponsored land trust.
Our evidence is specific to visa-free immigration and legal status for migrants. Post-plan, people can do things like get jobs in the formal economy, and which allows them to get things like housing permits, even if that's not mandated by the plan. As a result of being able to legally migrate, they would be able to do those things.
The brain drain impact, the report 17 says, quote, very small countries such as Pacific Islands or small African countries lack the capabilities necessary to be able to retain talents in many sectors. Which countries in ASEAN are small Pacific islands or small African countries that do not have infrastructure?
Like within ASEAN, like Laos and Cambodia are like relatively small. I think Brunei is as well.
How
and,
small do they need to be?
Well, this isn't making an argument that only small countries can lose it. Rather, because this is about failed states broadly. In the context of Myanmar, when millions of people leave the country because there's a military junta, they would obviously not be able to retain talent because no one wants to stick with an authoritarian regime or a military government. So even if this card in specific is about small countries, that is just because it's about individual high skilled workers leaving. But the link is distinct for this scenario.
That's fine. The taxes counter plan. How do we calculate the net present value?
Yeah, the Narast and the Smith evidence say it is a combination of an immigrant's age, their education, and also their income, and that and you linearly increase the amount they have to pay as a result of increases in quality of those factors.
Okay, cool. The T interpretation. What countries in status quo have completely open borders? Are there any examples of a country that has this right now? No? Okay, cool. Let's say, can you give me an example of a country that should have this?
The U.S. AF would probably meet this interp. They could say they need to bring labor in from abroad. I think that's one example. This AF could also just be read by taking in foreign labor as well. Some cards in the AF talk about that.
Okay, great. The stuff on case about middle power stuff fails. This seems to, what's the alternative to having ASEAN as a regional framework?
What do you mean?
This is we can't rein China in. If there is not ASEAN as a regional framework, what is there?
It's not that multilateral is bad. It's just that it's ineffective broadly. It's not saying that there's
an
alternative.
Asking what is this it is ineffective broadly, compared to what?
There's not an alternative that is more effective. The argument is just that great powers in general are indifferent to these multilateral institutions. So it's not like there's a more effective alternative, but multilateral institutions that really can't resolve great power competition.
Okay, that's fine. Starting prep. Stop prep. That was 146 used. 1 errors. Uploaded. Order is going to be case. Then it'll be T. Then it'll be the Indonesia counter plan. Or sorry, it'll be the Myanmar counter plan, the Indonesia counter plan, and the Texas counter plan.
Haiti, Myanmar, Indonesia, taxes.
Okay, let me open it. Okay, I'm good to go.
Integrated labor market is starting to create a unified ASEAN that's enabled to have a middle power to bring people to the negotiation table and consolidation more. Highly militarization means people are reliable to use economic force. 1 and 2, 1 distribution, deconstruction, cognitive centrality, coherence, post plan are necessary in order to have effective ASEAN. 1 and 2, changes to create private improvers also is able to use more centrality, able to deal with it, which is why it on the breakdown. 1 and 2, 3, the plan creates a new regional architecture by enabling negotiations. Getting China and Philippines to sit down the table. That's P22, 1 and 2, 4. Yes, there's more and more to use force, and it's why there's likely for miscalculation when you have so many countries that pass and militarize. 1 and 2, 5, the only country that's gone, also the only one that's gone China on the table for codes of conduct and past user cases because also the bill power the opportunity to meeting, so you should bet on empirical success and migration evidence. With more migrating, definitely is a question of whether it's through third-party syndicates. 1 and 2, 1 doesn't apply to people who look for a job that's don't having to say anything. Power trafficking, fuel organization, excellence, and manipulating illegal markets. He also doesn't solve the warrants, have some played ones, intervening causing escalation or escalation. The diversification argument they can't. 1 is document revenue, things like all kind of get their documentation from trafficking, second also they're using human time in order to have effective smuggling. 3 points, resource allocation to further countries are able to crack down on border control and customs when they have more money because they're not focused on when they're not focused on border control. The team. 1, we meet the plans of all countries and allies boards that's consistent with opening all borders for countries in ASEAN prefer planets and vacuums. The only objective metric to determine TL's debates to go aggressive or counter the competition disciplines are drawn from random impact cards, unpredictable logical plans dictate the function debate. Second counter interpretation of boards include boards are international organization transportation arbitrarily including core aspect lists with interpretation only real world model. 1 lead 1 board policy all people for the mission country there should say country where maybe open country the open country currently but the overworld travel some country members are multi command for traveling member nations to the EU the travel free leading country the sign agreement and of course all other countries limitation are topical ones to what that you make like all legal entry rights to open to some countries not others prefer. 1 Afghanistan policy advocating exists for countries with open small cause access to infinite picks out of countries that ask us have a solid to receiving countries with Sunday countries second topic answering as a core topic and guess what because it's necessary to check back things frivolous theory that have a justification in the 1 and 2 seem to get a new one. Myanmar. 1 con is bad, so the 1 area is last chance for offense reject the team argument is link 1 rescue, later logic and 9 focuses moral hazard talking 1 and 2 supports contradictions brings in a crushes frantic to cover door clash of focus is not a negative weak impact just at second reach advocacy lectures ideological flex and critical thinking is hard to reach at least a shallow to be set anti-indications are terminal value make dismissals are often the conditions of permutations or through argument thought about this as the counter that's at opposing cost negative steps the counterplan proper 1 permutation to the second permutation the counterplan third definition the counterplan the by errors proposing pills that matter about internal and external credibility 4 solving deficits 8 point unity counterplan practice also because it acts outside the regional framework arbitrarily including 1 of the member states only over integration of all states research all on strength that's 1 is the bossy beat labor market deficit. The counter conflicts creates unequal development because it doesn't fully result in access labor cut. The next card, third, the net benefits of that benefit of the counter conflicts my bad. That 5 straight their bets that World Bank to heroes like honey like whom the code could be economic there was and their 5th states warning the conduct of small African Pacific islands like African dreams good towards economic development China to bring data to the microsense and transition using this catalyst for good work is fund migration opportunity to sales power representatives and human capital to emigrate returning home skills and US financial assets from the cut the card at Jasper networks the Indonesia pick 1 permission to the counter plan second solvency deficit you need the counter plan factor also the access to the regional framework arbitrarily 1 of the member states only integration all states research also Texas places bossy but labor market as a counter conflicts creates unequal development because of the flavors on access labor that's 1 is dry cell 3 no link their term link term month migration with the nation normal 16 between any migration during process and response to terms like Richmond settle people that out Indonesia lands claim for the migration work they think they're meant for 5 non-unique deforestation 320 countries defaults for deforestation Indonesia 17,000 hectares with a big home producer total down deforestation 6 turn migrants are comparatively less likely to Christian adults and team which very pro global households are to agricultural production less likely to be involved with forest land appropriation research from new households more appropriation which is valuable forest cut the card at forest and the tax account plan 1 permutation to do a second permutation to the plan of levy progressive tax on migration function of immigrants fiscal net present value MPP with the revenue generated both paid fund pandemic preparedness solves no tax and human migration key more functionally to not tax into the firms or key tests unpredictable and cheating conflicts are artificially competitive because they're not changing to the plan 3rd perm to the plan the United States should levy a progressive tax on migration function of immigrants fiscal net present value with the revenue generated paid preparedness mentions the right line being solves the avid cross migration and cheating conflicts conflicts and policy owns with 20 and generates impact of impact of ranks to the market because the government finds the generation of general collar and everything and limited force solving deficits 8 unequal development migrants from other countries for than other conflicts proportionally means the countries where incomes can afford scale up others can conflict the tax skilled work is flat me migration high this which cost me migration to expensive to like ourselves okay so it's kind of plans to perform being this also applies to all of the migrations inevitable means that is only a question whether they have legal pathways or not because the kind of thing consults people are feeling desperate sorry also we're done
Okay.
No one in here has a nut allergy, right? Good.
Thank you for checking.
Okay. I wasn't sure.
proves the frame, the one year has not read a card that actually defines the phrase open borders, and the only one that they have that actually says what open borders means explicitly concludes negative and said that Schengen style between country borders do not meet. They have not met the minimum burden of proof that the and a Schengen style or integration within countries is actually topical at the top. Topical affirmatives must make open borders to open to human migration from every country, not just a small selection of participating member states. That means affirmatives must that introduce new members to regional trade agreements or create free movement between neighbors are not topical, because the vast majority of immigrants from most countries are still restricted from entry post-plan. Gut check. After the plan, ASEAN's members' borders are still mostly closed for every state that isn't in ASEAN. The border is identical to the status quo. That means their interim can leave the border mostly closed, which is a disaster for the NEG. Our interim evidence compares them explicitly in the context of policy and says that open borders cannot have border checks of any kind. The plan includes them because only members from participating states are admitted, which means that in order to determine who is and is not allowed, e.g. from ASEAN versus outside, you'd have to have those checks or some form of security in order to determine such. Prefer are often to the top one limits. They're the only impact you should consider because they determine the ability of the next to respond, allowing regional integration and affirmatives that open the border to one country, multiply the scope of the resolution by thousands. The topical is colossal with apps about every country, allowing new trade blocks, unions between Turkey and Armenia, and regional apps like Schengen and ASEAN, which makes the resolution unworkably large and gives the app a swath of new advantages that destroy next generics and transform the topic into an app flipping arms race class. Is the impact is the only benefit to debate because it's necessary to access the benefits of the activity for both sides, and link turns their topic education offenses. Second is ground. Every generic assumes a fully open border. Econ, charity, brain trade, counterplans about security and critiques. Every localization assume a fully open border, allowing subsets of the borders mostly closed like the plan to destroy link uniqueness and build in a whole swath of link turns to common DAs based on regional integrations, e.g. their arguments about how a common market solves the radically shift the scope of negative prep and derail clash and ground outweighs its reaction to the one EC and necessary for the debate to even occur, and reading their exact advantage of the different plannings solves any of the substantive reasons why the one EC is good. We should prefer our definition. Hornberger is describing an open borders policy with an intent to define and exclude. It is absolutely open and unconditional. It's anyone from anywhere. That's the most accurate in the literature. It's a salient controversy with tons of evidence from both sides. One is we meet the plan explicitly says in countries within, which means that they do not meet our interpretation because it's only selectively for the countries in the regional bloc and within ASEAN, because within ASEAN they do not meet our interpretation. It's only open to ASEAN states, which is not an open border because it's limited to a few countries. And also there's an argument of unconditionality that would drop for evidence. It does not entail a totally open border or an unconditional access. Every previous instance has included tons of border regulations, closures, and restrictions that are the opposite of an open border. They select one or two plan text in a vacuum. The stuff I did about in and within implicates this above, because even if you evaluate the plan text in a vacuum, they still violate our offense because it's only within ASEAN states. But it's bad. One, moral hazard, because it's vague plan writing allows the one-year skirt offense and teams to read the resolution in the plan and just add on words which no links to DAs, and forces T in the 2 and R because it forces T in substance in the 2 and R, which is impossible. And the 2 can choose one. It's app conditionality in disguise. 2 causes late breaking debates, causes ambiguity where debates don't start till the 1 year because they'll re-clarify what the plan means. 3, education. The plan is insufficient to understand the implications and mechanisms of the 1EC when they've read an advantage about labor integration. 4, counter-interpretation tags and cross-text determine the scope and mandate of the plan, which solves their offense about unpredictability because it's still their words. All the cards, the tags in the plans, or tags in the app, or it's this about regional integration. The 1 year 3 is the counter-interpretation. You should prefer evidence was done at the above. It's explicitly contrasting open borders till selectively letting in people, and it's the only one that definitively excludes the possibility of border checks. Now, this counter-interpretation card, they just do not meet their own counter-interpretation. You should read the Longley evidence after the round. The first part of it says, quote, open borders is free without restrictions, and then later in the card, they highlighted a section that says there are no currently open borders that exist, even though Schengen is between member states. This counter-interpretation goes negative. It says that people must unconditionally be allowed freely into countries, and concludes that the style of plan that the 1EC has enacted is not topical. 1 year 4 is all or nothing. This is not a definition card. It's just offhandedly mentioning the word open borders, and then has a line about the US in a random news article. It cannot guide negative preparation, and it's not a definition of a word in the resolution, but just a random blogger saying what they think open borders might be. Only we have evidence that is explicit about what open borders must be and what it is not, so you should prefer our evidence. 1 year 3 is picked. They're good. 1, background. Ds about open borders are essential to test the core mechanism of the topic. Ds like terror and tourism are the only stable and generic on a topic with no actor and no other limiting words. Every country's an app, so picks out of those states are necessary to give the negative a fighting chance. 2, don't believe the app. These picks are easy to beat. You need advantages intrinsic to your mechanism. Internal links about clarity, modeling, rights, and treaties all have built-in deficits to picks out of subgroups and regions. And our Africa app has beaten these args on substance all year. Even if this app can beat it, that's because it's bad, not because the game is rigged in favor of the neg. 3, they're good. They test the open borders part of the app. Tons of deficits about rights, norm setting, integration, trade, uniformity, create a ton of deficits in the literature about uniformity, capital flight, regulatory arbitrage, and tons of other economic justifications for total universality And that checks the core question of the literature for checks bad as often to arbiter bans them. Any unified reason border checks are bad for either advantage guarantees built-in deficits to every pick automatically, which means the sum total of APREF under interp is 1 card per advantage to flush. Out deficit 5 picks are good in the neg. They encourage specific plan writing and meticulous defense of the process with small after words. They force the neg into hypergenerics and encourage a swap the bad. Affirmative finally it's a panic. The picks on this topic do not win, and the ones about single countries never do. They get smashed every debate because every app has a defense of universality and border checks being bad because that's the core of what open borders means. Should we have people at the border checking or not? And the next argument about topic literature, there's tons of literature wanting to see evidence explicitly. There are tons of academics who believe in open borders and advocate for free movement and migration are wanting to see evidence citing the libertarian defense of the process of free migration policy. Proposals about open borders, right and good out, stop complaining, a better research stories and topic education matters, no evidence as ASEAN is key, US, Taiwan, etc. all have reasons why we need to let people outside of the country in to solve the aging crisis and increase the labor supply. So single country apps that let everyone in from outside still win on this predictability arguments and our definitional arguments turn topic research just because it would be good to debate these topics or that it would be more educational does not warrant that being the topic. If they might be right that debating the nukes app would be good for topic education or that would be more educational, but that's just a reason why we should debate another topic, not a reason why this is a predictable basis as a negotiating point of research. The last thing, conditionality on the other page is not relevant. He is a gateway issue. We had to read conditionality in order to respond to the app in the first place, because the negative is skewed for preparation, and he is a gateway issue because it's a question of whether the app is topical in the first place.
146 Queens A 314. way you should frame the debate as a 2NR has done a lot of weighing about why their definitions are the best for debating, so that is not a question of the definitions as a whole, but instead a question about which creates a better topic if we win their definitions are sufficient, and you should default to the question about which interpretation creates better debates. We'll look at our counter-interpretation that open borders can include border delineated between regional groupings. You should prefer one that's most predictable. The real world examples of interpretation are 0, that was cross, like no country has or ever will adopt open borders to everyone, which flips our predictability often because real world people define the literature which makes it most predictable. The most famous example of open borders is Schengen between EU countries, and our interpretation would allow, and theirs would not. Within theirs would not. You should view this about the way we adhere to topic literature. All the studies that are about how it impacts something like economic integration relying on pure consumption in the EU, which is just impossible. You don't have any country with open borders. Second is that it resolves every single one of your arguments. Functional limits zaps and egg often to 0. Very few solves the advocates of limited regional orientation. The advantage supply make 4 apps viable: African Union, EU, South Africa, US, Mexico. All huge apps are there by dozens of tons of debates like the topic tonight, like vaccine, terror, populism, contextual, like an impact on other apps with issues like not being about human movement or migration, which limits them out. Things like the Antarctic app is about human migration. The open borders app with China is not open borders, or complaining open borders with border abolition like the Korea app. Now, the limelight for the definitions debate that look at the evidence just as much a random blogger as ours, some random person from random libertarian saying that this is what he thinks open borders is, but implicitly doesn't actually agree with our definitions. Longly is fantastic. It's literally it's quote defining open borders. Seems like it has intent to define and exclude to me, which should be sufficient. Also proves that it answers the question about implementation, because it proves that things like EU and China get constant open borders means that it's resolved independently. Williamson is fantastic because an explanation that explains why a lot of people have a misconception about open borders, but then defines why open borders means that other people can't come in. You should use the question of topic literature as a tiebreaker on the question of predictability, i.e. if it adheres to what the common conception of what it is that what open borders is, and that should guide predictability. Now we're going for picks. This is not your average pick debate. The nature of resolution to make single picks resolution the most broken argument to like no one reads an app is interpretation. Open border policies benefit from both the sending country and the receiving countries. Directly reciprocal between group countries are regionally beneficial, i.e. integrating. Both single country open border apps like any of that ground, because you can't say like Germany open all borders apps with some benefit with the sending and receiving, because no one country is key to that advantage. It proves why it's impossible. They can just pick a tiny country like Tuvalu and say Tuvalu is making any work results in brain drain has a tiny set benefit like 100 deaths. The apps cannot generate any solid deficits because the 100 worker Tuvalu does not key to the app, but it is relevant to the pick. Between the distinction is that picks make the benefits, make control the sending country as opposed to the receiving country from getting receiving country. They open 165 borders, they can leverage benefits, which also should be defense to their limits argument because they still have 165 countries. Now, I'll do the line by line here. First of all, the first 2 arguments misunderstand because it's about the question of the mechanism. Theirs assume that there's apps in the status quo where you can have single country apps. Our problem is about the countries that are sending or receiving, not picks out of the countries defended by the plan. The third and fourth arguments do not respond. We agree that things like topical picks are good, but it said that sending and receiving countries are bad. The plan-specific apps picks are worse than plan-specific apps. One is still at a reduced nature debates or particularly to the borders with regards to the EU or South America apps, like especially Tuvalu, any round, which also flips all the limits argument. Hypergenerics are bad, at least the negatives. It will say something that app has no outside of the theory or Harvard generics picks do win because they're not our picks. They're not our picks. Things like country picks aren't the same as sending and receiving. Good debate.
Okay. Great debate. I end up voting affirmative. Here's how I get there. Ultimately, I believe the app is reasonably topical. On topicality, I think the neg has to pretty decisively prove to me that the app is out of bounds for me to vote. I don't think that's happening here. I think the app is slightly ahead in this debate. So first, on the definitions discussion, I think the Wilkinson evidence is at least as good, but probably better than the negative evidence on this question. In terms of intent to define, I think it's about equal. The Hornberger evidence says, what would open borders look like? The Wilkinson evidence says what open borders means. Both of those seem reasonably to be questions of intent to meet the standard of intent to define. I think from there, Wilkinson is slightly more specific on the question at hand. I think it is implied, not explicit in the Hornberger evidence. It's more talking about a lack of any sort of security apparatus at the border, which I think implies that it would have to be open to everyone, although it does not say that explicitly, whereas the Wilkinson evidence is very clear that open borders is not all or nothing. Legal entry and residency can be open to citizens of some countries, but not to others. On the question of specificity, I think it's better. I think ultimately what I come to believe is both are valid, semantically eligible interpretations of the topic. Which is sort of a prerequisite for me on the T debate. And so then it's a question of which of these interpretations is better. I think and here's how I get there. First, on ground, I'm slightly AF on ground. One important thing here is the Longley evidence. I think thinking of Longley as a definition in this debate, neg, is slightly wrong given the way the AF is utilizing it. What I take it to say is that there are no real-world examples of this interpretation of open borders. No country has adopted open borders under this definition. So it is I think basically the story is there are multiple semantically eligible interpretations of open borders. Both the neg and the AF definitions are eligible. The Longley evidence, though, says that the negative interpretation has no real-world examples. And I think this is important on the ground argument. So AF limits, that supports the AF ground argument. No real-world examples means that they're not able to garner, for example, strong empirical evidence. It also shows that it is like the ability to generate advantages and even disads for the neg become compromised by the lack of sort of empirical real-world examples as the AF outlines. So on ground then, slightly AF. On the ground standard, I think AF's limits to regional agreements, which does allow the AF to delink out of some generics. I think the neg is right there, but I think the AF proves to me that there's still enough for the neg. Real-world examples in the literature all have critics, and there are disads to all of these regional agreements and further integration. So I think that's fine. I think on the limit standard, regional agreements means that limitation in the AF interpretation means it's not completely absurd. They give me a case list that is, I think, much more limited than the negative case list. And I kind of buy that. Like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkey, Armenia, those kind of things wouldn't be eligible AFs under their interpretation. It'd be ASEAN, AU, South America. Maybe there's like 10 AFs, which doesn't seem completely out of bounds to me. It also seems somewhat non-unique. And the AF makes this point quickly in the 2AR. If the AF neg interpretation allows single country AFs open to everyone, that seems just as unlimited. Now maybe there's a question of the applicability of generics, but that's going to implicate some other things later. So the pick stuff. So I largely buy the AF framing that the picks that they are worried about are not picks out of countries that are part of the plan, essentially, like single country picks, but rather about picks from accepting migrants from particular sending countries, and those being much more powerful than the types of picks I think most of your defensive responses on picks have in mind. So most common advantages that I can think of under the neg interp of open borders to everyone defended in the literature would be things like labor shortages or things like global poverty. Maybe there's some others I'm not thinking of. But the AF argument that any single sending country being key to those advantages seems really, really hard to justify. Now, you make modeling arguments, but I don't quite get what that means in the context of the advantages to the types of AFs that the neg interp allows. Like I get with your Africa AF how that works, kind of. But I think that also, this gets into a lot of your defensive responses, do seem to be talking about the kind of picks that are like, no, not Rwanda or not Kenya as part of your AU app, as opposed to like, don't allow migrants from the United States or something to Africa, which I think is more what the app has in mind. So the other argument I find really persuasive from the app on the picks standard is essentially they're essentially saying I should like trust the market of debate, right? No one is reading these apps because they wouldn't win very much. Your argument is like, well, we win against these kind of picks, but I think like that's just not super persuasive to me. Like we're good and we win isn't necessarily an argument for your model being better, but also I think at least from like my deep reading of the wiki over the last few months, you're not really seeing many picks of the type the app is talking about. It is more things like the Kenya pick that are a different kind of pick than their arguments have in mind. So ultimately, I think it is close on a few of these arguments, but I think app is slightly ahead on the ground argument, slightly ahead on the picks argument, solving enough of limits that I don't feel that that's overwhelming. And I lean slightly app on the definitional discussion, which means I think the app is at least reasonably topical. I don't see a decisive negative argument that would persuade me to vote on T.
One question for definitions. Would it have helped to like point out the tension between the two definition cards? Because the first is like there are no currently open borders, even though there's like between, and then the next one's like having it between is open. So like there seems to be like some direct contradiction between the counterinterp card and the definition card they read below it.
Yeah, so I think this just depends on how you put this together, and I think someone taking this by the horns a little bit more could be effective. But even reading the tags in the 1AR, when the app read the 1AR evidence, I think it more suits the story that I understood, which is there are a few definitions, one of which has no real-world examples, the other of which does, right? And there's reasonable disagreement between those two things. So long the evidence says this is the definition, but also says no real-world examples. Wilkinson says this is the definition, there are real-world examples. I think it is reasonable on this topic, given like everything I've read and the arguments both of you are making, that there are plausible interpretations both directions, then it's a question of which one is better. So I don't think there is any decisive argument there. Now, I think the app could do a little bit better job of putting those pieces together in precisely that way. I think like the initial reading of the argument does that better for me than the 2AR, but the neg is giving me like no story except like this is a neg definition, it goes neg. But like I don't really actually think that matters if Wilkinson is also there, and the question is just, is there a semantically eligible definition for the affirmative, and then it's a question of which one is better. Now, if either of your definitions had made broader claims, right, not just this is defined as X, but made a claim of maybe what the consensus of the literature was or something along those lines, then that might be decisive on the question, right? But if it's just like two floating definitions out there, both of which seem perfectly plausible to me, then it's just a question of which one is better.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Only other things like better 2NR option or was T fine?
T was fine. I think probably a better round for me would have been somewhere on substance, maybe one of the picks. I think the app was pretty light on a few of them, and the 1AR was super, super, super fast on the picks, and I'll be honest, I missed a number of arguments on each of those picks, so it probably would have been a better strategy for you there. Topicality, for me, I'm like, it's not impossible, that's not what I'm saying, like, I'm fine voting on T, but if the app is at all, like, I don't know, reasonably in the direction of the topic and seems pretty fine to answer to me, it's not super wacky, like, it's just going to be an uphill fight most of the time, right? So unless there is, like, a decisive drop, a big mistake, against a policy app that's been read for 4 months and like there's good definitions and right there's a solid debate happening in both directions, it's just going to be a little bit harder for the neg, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a better strategy in this round for me would have been probably on one of the two picks.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
So you're totally right about the 1AR. Was there like somewhere that I like should have cut time out of, or was there like a better way to try and get those arguments? Because I was going to cover and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so in general, this is hard advice to give because it is so different for different judges, right? So like, but for me, like, honestly, there are only a few arguments on any of these picks or counterpoints that are really actually going to be decisive, right, in the round. So like, cutting out like one-line defensive analytics that, like, if you can't imagine it being something that I'm heavily referencing in my RFD, like, probably cut it out and make the decisive arguments much, much clearer for me. Like, making sure I get the arguments that you will go for, as opposed to just, like, trying to waste the negatives time with more arguments is probably a better strategy in front of me. But, like, I get it. Like, this is a really tough 1AR, so, like, I would have done my best to figure it out. Like, the reason this 1AR was tough was because of Muzi, not because of you, right? So I wasn't going to, like, hold that against you. But, like, I'll be honest, like, I did just miss a ton of stuff on the picks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll work on that.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I think it was a question. Thank you so
Yep.
much.
Yep. Muzi, you have any questions?
I think
Anyone?
that should be it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Good luck.
Thank you. Did I like die or do I just like misprint it up to an hour? Oh, yeah. What?
3:30 something.
Okay. Yo.
Hey, bud, you want a bagel?
I'm alright. Thank you though.
They were real pretty hard. They were the best.
You're awesome.
Yeah.
My,
Hey,
I need
yeah,
success.
congrats, you're so good.
I need success is literally just because I write down what Elmer says and then I repeat it around. Because Elmer is a bloody genius.
Okay,
Also,